All right, I'm strapped. Hold on, let me turn off the space heater. Okay, there we go.
Ladies and gentlemen, here we are. Welcome to the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. And with me for his first appearance is a very special guest, someone who I've known about for a few years now. I've heard him interviewed on several top-ranked podcasts, and here he is making his maiden debut on the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast to talk about not only his original book, Where the Footprints End, volumes 1 and 2, but now updating his bibliography with Ecology of Souls, Volume 1 and 2. And as we were talking about before we started, I'm a big fan specifically of chapters 8 and 9, as you are as well, which is exciting. So, Josh, let's get into it. I think people are probably familiar with you before. You're a Fortean researcher, someone who's taken high strangeness and legitimized it with a very, very lengthy list of sources, which I appreciate. Your Bigfoot book is one of a kind in the sense that it takes the conventions of the Bigfoot conversation and turns them upside down and shows people how strange this stuff really is, as much as the Jeff Meldrums of the world would like to make it a giant hairy monkey. I tend to agree with your interpretation that there's something much stranger afoot. So before I go off on my ramble here, Josh, how are you today? Welcome to the show.
I'm doing well. We've got, as we were talking about earlier, we've got a plague in the house. So if I sound a little stuffy, that's what that is. But I'm doing great, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Right
Yeah,
on.
it's really funny that you mentioned that about Bigfoot, because I've been getting more involved with boots on the ground folks. In fact, I was just out a week ago tomorrow at an overnight bigfooting hunt, big whatever you want to call it. I hate saying squatching, but like it's become really apparent to me the more I'm like getting firsthand interaction with a lot of people involved in the Bigfoot community. That even the people who still are adhering to the flesh and blood hypothesis will very quickly say off the record, yeah, but there's something about this that we just can't wrap our heads around. There's something about it that doesn't conform to this. I still think it's this model, but something about it doesn't conform to this model.
Right.
A great example was where I was Saturday night. It was like one of the most active sites in the Carolinas. And I was talking to some of the guys who had been there for a while, who had had a lot of activity and Class A sightings and stuff like that. And they said, but you know what? They said it's just not as active as it used to be because he put up the damn trail cams. And sure enough, like there's just you couldn't get away from trail cams there. And I didn't have diddly squat, or should I say diddly squatch, happen to me. So yeah, it's interesting. I feel like the Bigfoot community is finally starting to at least acknowledge this stuff, which is all that Tim Renner and I were really hoping, is just don't ignore it, don't write it off automatically. So
Right.
I'm sorry, I'm already off on a tangent here, but
No,
thank you
no,
so
no.
much. Thank you so much for the kind words. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, the well needed tangent, because we haven't done a proper Bigfoot show, and I thought this might be it until I read Ecology of Souls, and then I said, no, I want to talk about what's freshest on Josh's mind. You have done amazing work on Bigfoot, but we're not going to spend much time talking about it outside of maybe just now. But one thing that maybe could be a segue is the stone tape theory. You heard that right, folks. Stone tape, not stone ape. The stone
Right.
tape theory. Now, this is fascinating to me, and it does sort of cross over into the Bigfoot realm, because Bigfoot are often sighted in places where there are high amounts of mineral deposits, maybe limestone even, quarries, caves, mountaintops. They're often seen in places where there's a fair amount of stone, and the stone tape theory, I don't know who originally coined that term, but they posit that certain types of stone, can record memories, actions, events in a sort of energetic, magnetic way, and then maybe replay those events for, future observers.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, and that's something that I didn't really have as much time as I would have liked to go into an ecology of souls, because anybody who looks at it can tell like it's big enough, right? I had to like cut. I would have liked to have gone into, but we do have this underlying fundamental assumption in a lot of our cultures that ghosts equal dead people, and I'm still partial to that idea. But just like UFOs and the extraterrestrial hypothesis, it is not without its failings. And I think that also, like UFOs, the ghost thing might be a lot of different things. So it might be someone's left over, it might be their spirit left over, it might just be just a part of themselves, like just the ego. Like maybe the true part of yourself actually is reincarnated and the ego sticks around. But another one of those things is this stoned. Sorry, I keep on wanting to say stoned ape too. Stone tape hypothesis. Which I can't honestly recall who came up with it either. And I don't think that the mechanism has ever been really accurately described. But at the same time, we do know that obviously certain elements can hold certain charges. We do know that there's a close correlation between some electrical activity and certain minerals, the piezoelectrical qualities that you see in things like quartz when they're struck with a hammer. So of energetic relationship there. The frustrating thing about things like the stone tape hypothesis is you ask 20 different parapsychologists what mineral it is, you're probably going to get about 10 to 15 different answers. You know what I mean? Because some people do say limestone, which I'm a fan of because it's organic material to begin with. But you'll also hear granite thrown out there a lot. And to your point, there's so many granite deposits in Pennsylvania. And such a strong amount of Bigfoot activity there too. It seems like there's something there. So the idea that I end up having is that like it's not just one thing, or if it is one thing, one quality, it has to be in really sufficient amounts to generate some sort of activities. What I mean by that is, okay, yeah, if you have a mass grave, you're probably going to get a haunting. If you have one dead person and a lot of limestone and it's near an underground stream, then maybe you'll also get. So it could be like some sort of additive threshold that has to be reached. But I think that the stone tape idea, or even just more broadly, the idea that our energies can leave impressions on things, goes quite a way to explain how not only some of these ghosts seem to not be intelligent, they just play out their actions and continue walking through walls where there used to be a hallway, but now there's a wall, but also explains how these things can be transferred. A lot of people jump to the idea that, don't buy something from Goodwill because it might be demonically possessed or something. But I think, just as easily you could say, oh, it just has the impressions of the owner or something behind it. So, yeah.
Right. And it is aptly named the ecology of souls because we're not dealing with a monolithic type of, we're not dealing with a monolithic phenomena here. We're dealing with a entirety of the human experience with death and with the paranormal. And I love that you started off with a really interesting quote from Chris Knowles that goes something like, you don't often encounter the paranormal without death being somewhere in the background or the foreground. He probably said it differently, but that's essentially what he's saying. And I think there is a grave seriousness to many of these, what we would probably think of as not so serious encounters with fairies and ghosts. I mean, the poltergeist activity, yes, that seems a little more strange and maybe a little more dangerous where you have things flying around your house. But I think American culture has sort of watered it down to the point where now it's quarantined into the realm of children's imagination. And I think where we should start is the difference or the lack of difference between the imaginal realm and the real realm, and how even some old cultures don't even have a distinction really between the two, and their imagination is not seen as some sort of fantasy.
Well, the idea of the imaginal versus the imaginary is something that I try to employ from time to time throughout Ecology of Souls, and I think it's a really useful way to describe, as I put it. This is not the the textbook definition, but as I put it, the imaginal is in your head. Sorry, I mix it up. The imaginal is from your head, but not in your head, if that makes any sense. So what I mean by that specifically is that the appearance of a lot of these phenomena seems very much dependent upon culture. It seems very much dependent upon our own personal biases and our own personal expectations. And this is sort of tying with some ideas that one of my mentors, Greg Bishop, has been a champion of lately, which is this idea that somehow these phenomena co-create us. And I'm of the personal opinion, I don't have anything to back this up yet, but I'm of the personal opinion that a lot of these phenomena, probably if you could distill them to their truest form, they're probably the lights. I mean, I don't know if you've ever played old computer games, but every now and then when I was, in high school, I'd be playing games on computer, there would be a text file that would be corrupted. And like, so where the texture should be on the wall, it's just like a wall or something, or a wall like a placeholder color. And I kind of think sometimes that that's what the lights are. The imaginal is, I think the textbook definition is something along the lines of a boundary realm between two worlds that are each structured according to their own sort of conventions that unfold according to a certain amount of causality. And I think that one of the examples that I like to use is, characters in a play or something. The scenario is always in a play or a film fictional, right? But you can see, for example, a love affair fall apart in a film, and it could have never happened, but it could be like the truest depiction of that you ever seen. You know what I mean? And by extension, the emotions that you feel, the emotions that are engendered by this completely imaginary thing, are indeed actually real to you. Like, you can't quantify them, you can't measure them, but you still feel as if you're in that situation. So I guess we're sort of verging on the edge of like simulation ideas, but that's sort of the rough way that I break down imaginal versus imaginary. And imaginal is something that draws upon, in addition to your own personal biases, the sort of Jungian collective unconscious that we all share and don't really realize we share actively as human beings.
Right. It is tantalizing to use the technology analogy. The simulation has made its way into the consciousness, and I'm a little more in favor of the organic interpretation, but there is an organic interpretation to computers if you really go back far enough, right? So maybe co-creation rather than simulation is a better place to pivot, because I feel like we're all aware of our co-creative abilities to some degree. We've all experienced a sort of mild telepathy where someone's staring at you and you realize it. That's a co-creative action right there.
100%. One of the examples that I like to use, I mean, even if you're not artistically inclined, everybody has doodled, and that's something, you're bringing something out of that imaginal realm into the real, even though you're not actually making a horse, you're doodling a horse, and even though it might not look great, you've brought something from your mind into reality, and that of course is just simple magic.
Yeah, and I tend to think that animals in particular skirt that realm in an interesting way. Like, you can have an encounter with an animal in the wild that feels like a dream. I mean, I can attest to this. I've had several. One of them, I was on psychedelics on top of a mountain that I later found out is a sacred mountain around here with a couple different ceremonial sites on top of it. And I'm sitting there on a rock, and a deer comes over to me and sort of stares at me. I'm like 5 foot above it, on this big tall rock, sitting down very, very still. And this deer and I had a moment of just surreal. The sun was setting, the light was glowing through the trees, and it just stared at me, and I beheld this amazing sight in front of me. And it's moments like that that make you realize, either nature's way more magical than we're told in school, or B, maybe I was tapping into something, right? It definitely brings up a bunch of questions, but I was really excited when I saw that deer are a part of your ecology of souls, and they sort of play a big role in certain cultures as psychopomps, or beings that lead people to the underworld or the afterlife.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring this up because I just actually, speaking of Chris Knowles, had a conversation with him on
Yeah.
Wednesday night, and we sort of got at a little bit of a loggerhead on the Bigfoot thing. Not that he was mostly playing devil's advocate, and I was trying to emphasize how much this high strangeness regarding Bigfoot had been suppressed. But he made the point that he's had also interactions with animals that have really seemed to really get close to being numinous. To use a fancy schmancy academic term. And, we used to realize this. We used to realize that animals can be animals and they can also be vectors for something more. I mean, just as the way that human relationships, like a human can be someone that you just are walking down the street, but depending on, you know, circumstances completely within their control, they can be a vector for love or compassion or hate or or any number of things. So I think that's something that we used to really, as a species ourselves, we used to really, pay attention to that. And not so much anymore. But a good example of how these things tend to skirt that line, which is a great way of putting it, is the psychopomps, as you alluded to. I think that one of the things that caught my attention early on when I was really getting getting in earnest into the UFO subculture, was the work of someone who I now call a dear friend, Mike Cleland, who, I don't know if you are familiar with his work, but he talks about UFOs and owls, and I know Mike very well, and Mike has never has never made any indication that he thinks every owl is somehow related to UFOs, right? Like, he realizes that there are physical owls that, eat, breathe, shit, like all those things. But at the same time, some of these owl interactions are really uncanny and strange. And whether that means it's the actual owl being used by strange metaphysical phenomena like UFOs, or whether that means that, the metaphysical powers, and being very vague here, uses the imagery of the owl. Either way, sometimes that distinct, just a flesh and blood animal and something more meaningful, does get blurred clearly. And I'll be damned, owls are another one of these psychopomp figures, like the deer that you mentioned. If you look through sort of indigenous cultures worldwide, you'll find time and again birds, dogs, and horses as psychopomps. But they do vary from region to region. And in Norse cultures especially, you might find an association of deer with psychopomp functions, especially because they have that association with Odin. I guess we should probably define what a psychopomp is. So a psychopomp is any figure that leads you across the threshold from life into death. And we culturally know this most often as the Grim Reaper, right? Like, that's very much in our pop culture consciousness. But, these can be deities, they can be folk figures, deities like N.E.M.M.E.S.S, Hermes, like, these are all common psychopomps. Odin had some psychopomp functions. Psychopomp is almost like, it's not an identity so much as it is a duty. So there are some characters that are just psychopomps, but there's some characters that pull double duty, like Hermes and like Odin.
Right, it's a role.
Right, and but also natural phenomena. So the sun, the moon, the aurora borealis, and, as we've been talking about here, animals. And what I find really interesting, because I always suspected that there might be some sort of UFO psychopomp connection, or at the very least, paranormal phenomena psychopomp connection. But it really is uncanny to look at the number of UFO encounters that include these psychopomp animals. Like, we've already alluded to, Mike's work with owls and UFOs. But, dogs are a recurring figure in a lot of UFO contact. Horses are, to a little bit of a lesser degree. But also, yeah, I mean, deer, one of the most famous examples that Bud Hopkins talked about. Your mileage with Bud Hopkins may vary. Mine certainly does. But one of the most famous abductees that he studied was Virginia Horton, who had a memory of following a deer into a forest and emerging bloodied, and under hypnotic regression revealed that, again, hypnotic regression, your mileage may vary, but she revealed under hypnotic regression that she had actually encountered what she thought were extraterrestrials as part of her ongoing contact. So you see the deer in that scenario, this sci-fi extraterrestrial UFO scenario. You see the deer occupying the exact same role that it has for literally millennia, leading someone from our reality into another, which is the same function as the psychopomp. You find these sort of fairy deer in a lot of fairy stories, where oftentimes they'll sort of lure a hunter into the forest where they might encounter a maiden or something, or vice versa, lure a maiden into the forest where they encounter, a fairy king or some person trapped by the fairies, often the dead people trapped by fairies. So it's just interesting to me that these old motifs keep on playing out again, and how a lot of the quote unquote mainstream researchers just don't really want to view it through that mythopoetic lens, that quasi-religious spiritual lens. And I think that's, maybe that's changing a little bit. I don't know.
Well, and I really do give it up to folks like yourself who come from the academic realm and venture into that territory. I myself dropped out of college, and I think my mind was saved by books like The Secret History of the World by Mark Booth, because it gave me an interest in history that didn't sterilize everything, right? It gave me a view of history that wasn't so watered down and dense, and not that you can't find those sorts of things in the academia. Of course you can. It's just way less accessible than, what the New Age community sort of purports. And I'm not a proponent of the New Age information altogether. I think you need to sift through that with just as much skepticism, but absolutely, the idea that there was a sacred or a spiritual version of history was so incredibly motivational for me as a curious mind. Wow, okay, there is another version. Let's go into this. And I appreciate the work you've done in Ecology of Souls so much, because it shows people that the emphasis might have been misplaced. We tend to emphasize the characters. We tend to emphasize the players. And I think Ecology of Souls shows the arena where the actions are taking place might be just as valuable to understand, or equally as potent. The idea that, when we pass, we enter a different reality that's like a mirror to our own. I mean, this is something that's conveyed in so many different old cultures, as you write in your book, and the Book of the Dead, which was another big read for me when I was younger, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, or the Bardo process. And I mean, when I read that as a young man, it didn't feel like my intuition. My intuition was wow, you just read truth. And that was a rare experience, right? And you confirm, you kind of make the same point in the book that the Bardo, I'm not going to try to pronounce the Tibetan full name of that book. It confirms itself in its genuineness.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Well, first of all, congratulations on breaking free from academia. I, on the other hand, somehow got over and made it out unscathed. I wound up with 2 master's degrees, but it was interesting, being in postgrad for that long and seeing the number of people who their takeaway was what to think as opposed to how to think, And then I worked at the University of Georgia for 3 years, and man, there is nothing else that will sour you on academia more than being in a staff position at a major university, seeing how the sausage is made. And I'm not I don't want to paint with too broadly a brush, because obviously you can tell from my work, I honor that academic process and footnotes and endnotes and references and, backing up what you say. And there are plenty of people who are tenured academics in my life, my academic life, but also in my professional life now, whom I admire to the moon and back. But monolithically, the institution itself has a lot of problems. But speaking directly to that sort of Bardo stuff, yeah, that's really interesting, because pretty much anybody who has a background in the actual accounts of near-death experiences takes a look at that text, and the Bardo Todal Thodal. I'm taking the flack for you for mispronouncing it, but the Tibetan Book of the Dead looks at that text and says, oh, this looks really accurate. Two that come to mind are Gregory Shushan, who is a near-death experience researcher who specializes in ancient and indigenous cosmologies, and how the near-death experience was presented in those and manifests almost identically in modern near-death experiences. He was like, yes, much like what happens, and so was Carl Jung, who had, I mean, we think of Jung as a psychiatrist, but he might as well be thought of as a mystic. I mean, he believed in some very strange things, it seems, and he at least entertained the idea of a lot of these phenomena. And he too thought that what he read in the Tibetan Book of the Dead was so close to what he had heard from these experiences that it seems as if they indeed did sort of break that barrier between worlds. And then you talk about the Bardo, and it takes us into psychedelics and entheogens and all that stuff too.
Well, and even the to point at Jung again, he compares the modern UFO mythos as I think the Charon from the Greek, which is a psychopomp.
So I finally broke down, and I'm like, I just typed it in Google. I'm like, fuck, how do you pronounce Charon? And it's Karen.
Karen.
So yeah, I want to make a meme that has a guy on a ferry and it says "Don't be a Karen," right? But yeah, Karen. Yeah, and it's one of those. So like, I feel like a lot of my work, and this is, I'm not trying to brag here, but I just feel like this is what I'm noticing as I'm doing this, is a lot of what I do is stuff that people have talked about, but they've just like talked about in passing, like they've mentioned it like in a sentence or in a paragraph, and they move on. And a lot of what I try to do is go, no, wait, back up. Like, let's explore that, let's unpack it. And sure enough, in his 1958 essay on flying saucers, which I think should be required reading for anybody who's interested in UFOs, Jung mentions in passing, the idea that UFOs might be some sort of Karen is not one that I have found in the literature so far. And nobody really, took that and ran with it. I guess until now, but that's the sort of thing that I like to drill down on and say, okay, let's see how far we can take this and see if maybe we might learn something from it. So yeah, and it quickly gets into uncomfortable territory for a lot of people. I mean, if you walk up to someone on the street and you say, I think UFOs might take us to the other side, they'll be like, okay, or the idea that, you alluded to the mirrored quality of the afterlife. If you say, I think that the afterlife might be a mirror image of our own that's capable of its own technological evolution, it's like, okay, so you think people can build machines in the afterlife that cross that threshold? And you're like, yeah. And it's backed up in a lot of the indigenous stuff. It was a surprisingly early idea that a lot of ufologists across the pond in England played with. You can find this idea referenced as far back as the 50s. But, American ufologists just didn't really want to talk about it that much.
Yeah, there was a story in your book, very short, where somebody was walking their dog in a field. A UFO lands or hovers near them. Their dog, their cows all freeze, and some naked humanoid-looking aliens come out, and from the ship you hear, I am Jimmy Hoffa. I am Jimmy Hoffa. And I'm thinking to myself, like, who is this? Like, I want to know about that guy that saw that UFO. What's his world like? I have had a firsthand experience with a psychopomp, if you will, and I didn't think about it until I was looking through this book. But 2 or 3 years ago, when my grandfather passed away, about a week before his passing, I was recording my conversations with him just because I had the feeling like he's not going to be around for much longer. And he woke up one morning and told me this dream that his old best friend who had passed away 20, 30 years ago was sitting in a familiar place. He didn't know where it was. And his friend told him, Fred, you're going to die. I'm going to see you very soon. And my Pepe knew, like he knew with his the way he stared me in the eyes, like he was going to die. And it was it's been some years now, but it was a very moving, powerful moment for me. And now I'm kind of realizing that his friend played the role of a psychopomp in that dream. incredible.
Yeah, that's something that I left out. Human beings can serve that role as well, especially those who have passed on before, or depending on the culture. We'll use the term shamans broadly to describe medicine men and cunning women, etc. But shamanic figures, if they couldn't, if you were suffering from an illness, it was generally perceived to be some sort of spirit theft, or that your spirit had wandered. And their first order of action was to try to retrieve your spirit. And if that failed, then they shifted duties and were like, okay, well, we're going to escort their soul over to the other side in a lot of these cultures, where they would go into a trance and sort of literally take your soul to the afterlife. It's interesting that you mentioned that about your grandfather. That's an awesome story, and I think it does underscore how, because you say psychopomp to people, and half the people you would say, I have no idea what you're talking about. But like, these ideas still present themselves. They still manifest themselves, and there are a lot of these contemporary near-death experiences that if you read them, it's like, oh, you met Odin. Not that I'm saying that there's some sort of like, objectivity to the Norse pantheon or anything, but you can see these archetypes showing up again. Oh, you met Odin. Oh, you met Anubis. You see this time and again. I had a good friend of mine, Collier, his grandfather, and we've been talking about ecology. It wasn't quite out yet, but we talked about the idea of the bird being a psychopomp, in addition to being expression of the soul. We talk about a lot of ideas being universal, but like the idea that the soul appears as a bird is literally universal. Like every indigenous people across the world made that connection. So Red and I were talking about this, and he made a mention that at his grandfather's death, he was always really impressed by walking into the home, and there was a raven that was sitting on his grandfather's old boat. And I said, Ren, but I said, it gets even better than that. Like the raven was, my friend's name is Ren. This is a raven. I said, Ren, the raven was sitting on your grandfather's old boat. Like, that's double trouble, because the boat is, in terms of inanimate objects, like the most potent psychopomp symbol. Again, we alluded to Karen, but Odin was a ferryman in some of these stories. Boats and modes of transportation like that show up in near-death experiences. That's probably why horses were considered psychopomps, is because they could carry you. I think it's really interesting once you take that idea, like, oh, so transportation is a psychopomp theme. And then you look at the UFO phenomenon, which is entirely obsessed with transportation, right? Like, where do they come from? Where are they going? Where are they going to take me? Why are they here? It's all obsessed with transportation. And so look at it through that lens. Yeah, of course the UFO can be viewed as a psychopomp symbol. I don't know if it literally objectively is, but it can at least be, I think it's a more legitimate interpretation than a lot of people would be comfortable with.
Yeah, it certainly feels like it's appropriate to blur the lines when these things are so blurry to begin with. Like, this compartmentalization of ideas is really, I think, a holdover from the Carl Linnaeus, type of combing through these things. And there's a use for classification, but I think what your book does so well is it shows how many of our occult giants, people who've written about these things, they've been thinking about these ideas. I mean, when you're reading Ecology of Souls, you're reading Jung, you're really reading Licoteau, you're reading Devereaux, you're reading all these people with your thoughts intermixed, and you're showing how, these things are far more connected than we've given credit, and even fairies are. I mean, you don't conclude anything, which also I love that too. You give a couple options. So let's go through the options with the fairies real quick. I'm sure everybody's familiar with fairies, but if you'd like, you maybe give an introduction on this, because you spent some time researching this phenomena for From Where the Footprints End books, right, with Sasquatch and their connection to fairies. But it seems that fairies also could have a really close connection to us as human beings, maybe in our ancient past, or maybe even as the next phase, where we go in the afterlife. Maybe we become fairies and live in little fairy villages.
Yeah, it's so I know a lot of people probably would think that I'm a fence sitter or something for not coming to conclusions, but I've always tried to avoid what Greg Bishop calls the certainty fetish. And then, like, people who are into UFOs and cryptids and ghosts and stuff, they've been marginalized for so long and told that they're deluded for so long that they quickly adopt that certainty fetish because they want to prove that something is this or that. And I think at the end of the day, we just need a more diverse set of hypotheses presented, so that we can pivot whenever one seems to show more promise. So I appreciate that you noticed that. Yeah, the fairy thing. Yeah, I've had a long-standing interest. Honestly, I was probably interested in the fairy stuff before I was interested in the UFO stuff. Until I realized that it was the same thing, right? And I can defend that position. I won't do it right now because I won't eat into our time. But the fairy dead thing is something that I've been thinking about for a while because, well, to that point of the UFO phenomena being a modern expression of these older fairy folklore beliefs, in 1969, Jacques Vallée released Passport to Magonia. It's a foundational text to the way that I look at things, but I think in that book he handily illustrates that a lot of this modern UFO phenomena is a reworking of fairy folklore worldwide, actually. But if you really want to drill down and get a little bit more specific, Western Europe in particular. Since then, I found a lot of correspondences that Vallée left on the table, but the fact that he made that connection, I think, is really important. But the thing that I say haunts the background of Passport to Magonia, and that is the lingering question of what would a 13th century version of Passport to Magonia look like, and what sort of connections would they be trying to draw? I would argue that where Passport to Magonia says, hey, look, this UFO stuff looks a lot like the fairy stuff, an older version, a medieval version of Passport to Magonia would have said, hey, look, this fairy stuff looks a lot like the way that we talked about the dead. And that's not an especially insightful revelation on my part. There are, I believe there's a gentleman by the name of, I believe it's Lewis Spence, who basically had a book that was just talking about the similarities between fairies and the dead. But, even contemporary scholars will say that, look, prior to theosophy, prior to the late 19th century, cultures that thought about the fairies typically didn't think of them as nature elementals or any of these things that we like to think of them as today. They were always closely associated with the dead. And if you go back and look at the older fairy stories, not fairy tales, but fairy stories that supposedly come from firsthand interactions from informants in Western Europe and whatnot, you'll find that all the time. You'll find, as you alluded to, that people might die and become fairies. They might die and be seen with the fairies. The number of stories where somebody has taken fairyland and they're about to eat or drink in fairyland, which is a bad idea because you'll be stuck there forever. The stories where that narrative unfolds and the person is stopped from eating or drinking by someone who died in their village the year prior. It's a common recurring theme. And there are some indications here and there that they might have served psychopomp functions. N.E.M.M.E.S.S, the Welsh fairy king, sort of changed, as a lot of these sort of pagan deities did, from a pagan god or goddess into a fairy king or queen, but he still retained his duties of collecting souls. And to that extent, a lot of fairy phenomena, by which I mean large black dogs, anomalous lights, things like that, or even just the act of seeing the fairies or a fairy funeral, a fairy funeral procession, any of these things might serve as death omens. And so there's been this long-standing connection between fairies and the dead that has gotten washed away along with everything else as it became Disney-fied. Fairies are helping the plants. I watch too much Fantasia, and they're little women with wings that have, it's not, the actual folklore does not suggest that. It suggests something that, while I wouldn't go so far as to say malicious, is at the very least capricious and quite dangerous, but does always have this connection to the dead. And that's equally clear in where they tend to congregate. A lot of these fairy sites are old human dwellings, and that really does beg the question as to whether or not, did the fairies move in, or are these people who just never left?
Wow, yeah, that's particularly where I was hoping we'd get to, because all across New England, where I live in Connecticut, in the southern part of Connecticut, but all across New England, there are stone structures, menhirs, stone circles, stone chambers, standing stone walls that are, miles and miles and miles long. And my interest in local history started with the question of, how old are these stone walls? Because you see them everywhere. They're in people's front yards, they're in people's backyards, they're on, hiking trails, they're everywhere. And some of them look very old. And we've found examples of stone rows that are clearly Native American construction or have signs, evidence that they're very old. And there's a feeling in these areas, specifically the ones that are sort of isolated in the woods. And the cairns, which also dot the landscape, have a much older origin and an association with fairies and Hermes, which we mentioned briefly. We mentioned Hermes, but Hermes kind of has this association as the god of roads, the god of these cairns. So can we get into that a little bit and talk to that point?
Yeah, well, so the connection between in the old world, the connection between fairies and just hills, mountains, etc., is probably of origin. Probably that origin probably lies in beliefs regarding the dead. It was often conceptualized that the dead would live under hills or inside mountains. There's even some indication amongst some Norse scholars that Valhalla actually, its roots came from meaning, mountain, hall being rock. You do find a lot of allusions to the hills and the mountains being the domains of the dead. And that right there is interesting that fairies have such an association with these sites. But also, there's a lot of confusion, especially in Western Europe, regarding how many of these hills are natural and how many are actually burial tumuli. Some people say that the idea that the fairies have a massive amount of wealth inside their fairy hills is actually an allusion to grave goods, treasure buried with the dead. And sure enough, you'll find that people will see is around a hill, and when the hill is eventually excavated, it's revealed not to be a hill, but actually a burial monument. So there's that connection, and I find it especially compelling that if you take a look at, I'm down here in the Southeast, and if you take a look at a lot of the Cherokee mythology, it just reads like something straight. Now, some people might say, that there was some sort of old world influence pre-Columbian. I'm not necessarily dismissing that, but I find it equally, if not more interesting, that no, the reason that the Cherokee were describing this identically to the Irish and the English and the Scottish is because they were describing something objectively true that they were interacting with. And man, just some of the N.E.M.M.E.S.S stories that you get from the Cherokee legends is they're just incredible. And there's a strong association with these tumuli again in the American Southeast. There's missing time in N.E.M.M.E.S.S stories. In some N.E.M.M.E.S.S stories, there's the indication that they do help you go to the afterlife. There's even an N.E.M.M.E.S.S story where the N.E.M.M.E fairies visit a village and they say, hey, if some of you want to go with us, that's cool, but we're going to be moving our townhouse, our mound, in a week, and everybody has to be quiet here or it's not going to work. And the appointed time comes, and the sound of the mound flying through the air, which again, what does that sound like? The sound of the mound flying through the air scares everyone, and they shriek, and so the mound tumbles to the ground, where supposedly it still stands to this day. I haven't gone looking for it myself, but that's the mound at S.E.E.E.N in, I believe, Western North Carolina. So, some people will look at that, and again, they'll have that ancient aliens impulse, and they'll say, oh, well, it was obviously a UFO. And it's like, well, maybe we should, that's an okay hypothesis. I get where it comes from. Sure. Interesting. Let's also turn the idea on its head and say that these things are not aliens, but what we perceive as being aliens are actually these other sort of spirit-based phenomena that are carryovers from the ecology of souls trademark.
Right. And I do prefer this interpretation. It feels more organic. It feels more human for some reason. Maybe that's just my own perspective. But I do believe you had another story in North Carolina, or at least it takes place in North Carolina, around Pilot Mountain, and a big stone door that these fairies said like, hey, there's going to be a lot of war and sickness. Maybe you guys want to come live with us underground. And they went through a stone door on Pilot Mountain. And what really struck me with this is past guest on this show, Peter Shampoo, has written a book called Gaia Matrix, which you might be familiar with. And it talks about ley lines, but also ley circles, and he doesn't use the term ley. He prefers sort of the energy concept. He's a dowser and a stonemason, Peter Shampoo, but he talks about at Pilot Mountain there is a convergence of 6 or 7 energy lines in this sort of what he describes as a biome, right? And that biome is a circle that centers at Pilot Mountain, and the Great Smoky Mountains is the diameter of that circle, the length of the Great Smoky Mountains. So he's saying that the energy, much to what we were talking about before about the arena, or at least what I said about the arena being more interesting than the players themselves in some cases. Like, we have these ley lines, these magnetic or electric energies that are passing through an area. Maybe this is where the charge is created that we tap into as co-creative beings to experience maybe what is invisible when we're not there, right? Or what's there when we're not there. Because how do we know
I think you're absolutely onto something there. And I wasn't aware of that, but that's fascinating. Yeah, the ley lines thing is just interesting in the way that, there's obviously something to it, right? I find it kind of frustrating that I feel like I ask 10 different lay hunters and I get 10 different locations of these things. But I think that the idea is really sound, and it's been with us and continues with us and just won't go away. And, even in, I was shocked to find this, but even prior to Alfred Watkins discussing ley lines, obviously you've got the Chinese dragon paths and all that stuff. It's an old idea, but like in Evans Wentz's, Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries in 1911, he speaks to, I believe it's an Irish informant, who basically says that she thinks that the fairies appear along these magnetic currents in the earth. And I'm like, that's really, really early for that idea to be showing up and to specifically bring the magnetism into it. And, this is where people might fall into the reductive trap, right? Because there's some sort of overlap between telluric and ley lines and fault lines. And people have said that, well, as we alluded to earlier, the piezoelectrical qualities along these fault lines might be able to generate magnetism. And sure enough, there do seem to be anomalous lights that happen along these fault lines. So people take that bit of information and they take, those Dan Michael Persinger experiments, which a lot of people don't talk about, but are unreplicable. They haven't been replicated, as to my knowledge. But this idea that significant amounts of magnetism with Persinger's God helmet generates senses of entities near you and things like that. And they say, okay, well, that explains the paranormal, and they sort of dust off their hands. But they never stop to ask whether or not this magnetism, much like I think you and I would both agree regarding some entheogens, they never stop to ask whether or not this is actually a mechanism for perceiving into something objectively real, And I find it interesting that if these ley lines do correspond to these ancient sites, which, most of them had to have had, ritual and shamanic functions, not only could this magnetism amplify a seer's abilities to actually interact with these objective other intelligences, but the appearance of strange lights along such areas would certainly reinforce the validity of the seer's experiences in the eyes of observers too. Oh, well, you said that you went into a trance and saw a fairy. Well, while you were doing that, we were watching these lights bob along the hill, that sort of thing. So I think it's really interesting when you take all that and then you combine it with some other things that seem to have some connection, like, epilepsy. There's a strong correlation between epilepsy and, the Asiatic shaman traditions specifically. And it starts to sort of look like, well, maybe we're confusing the room maybe we're confusing the key with the room it unlocks, right? People who just say it's just all magnetism affecting the brain. They're saying, oh, look, the key is the room. And it's like, no, the key opens up the room and there's stuff in the room. The key's
Right.
just a way to get into it. Yeah.
Right. Wow. Brilliant. Yeah. I think that's a really apt way of describing it. This is the confusion of the intangible. We want to have that conclusive definitivism about everything, the certainty that you described earlier. But what's really fascinating is whether this key room debate exists or not. You can't debate that people build stone structures, especially ancient stone structures, in places where this magnetic energy tends to be very heightened. I mean, here in the New England area, we have what's called a diamagnetic landscape because of all the granite. Whereas in maybe a place like Panama, we have like a paramagnetic landscape because the concentration of minerals is different. And what a past guest who's an architect was describing to me is that in these diamagnetic environments, the stones have a different property. You can maybe levitate them under the right circumstances. And you'd have to imagine that, okay, maybe there are points in that diamagnetic landscape where that energy is at a maximum or it's at its peak, right? So we find as human beings these peak sites, and then we go and we utilize the energy that's already there to move the stones and create these things that seem unexplainable because we don't have the key to the room to explain it.
Yeah, and we have so many fallacies. Like, in addition to just language being such a clunky tool, I think we often mistake chickens and eggs a lot more than we like, and the idea that no, the site wasn't built there because it was special. The structure wasn't built there because the site was special. The structure couldn't have been built anywhere else because it could only be built at this site. I think is an interesting way to look at it that not a lot of people would consider sort of reversing the qualifications for erecting something like that. And again, this is part of the reason that. I'll be honest. Like the subtitle for Ecology of Souls, a new mythology of death and the paranormal, I resisted putting in there for a long time because new mythology sounds really pretentious, like it's being really comprehensive or something. But then I just deep into this, I'm like, no, it really is comprehensive because then you start to look at like these ley lines and the insistence across a lot of cultures that spirits travel in straight lines, and it seems that part of what they're describing is this ley line function that perhaps is not the only way that spirits can travel, but maybe the path of least resistance. And you'll find all throughout Europe that there is this belief that spirits do travel in straight lines. You'll often find the road between the cemetery and the churchyard is perfect, and nothing should be erected along it. Which, of course, brings into the idea of fairy paths, right? And how you shouldn't build a house across a fairy path. But it's also the idea where we get dream catchers and we get witches' bottles and we get labyrinths. The idea that the spirits get lost in this complexity. I mean, one of the ways in South Carolina folklore among the Gullah people is that if you have a boo hag, sleep paralysis sort of hag old crone figure, you can prevent sleep paralysis by putting a colander or a broom on your front porch, and the boo hag will get distracted by like counting the holes in the colander or by counting the straws on the broom. Spirits seem to be arrested by complexity, and so you have this idea of the straight lines and spirits needing to travel in straight lines and spirits traveling between these sacred sites used for rituals. And you also have, and again, this idea is not exclusively European. There are these roads called Sekbeab in, I believe, Colombia. They're throughout like Central America and Upper South America. And there are these straight lines that just travel between sites and they don't deviate. They just go right across rugged terrain when it would be easier to go around. So you have this straight line idea and this spirits traveling a straight line idea and this ley line idea, and then you start to place that against the modern UFO thing, and you see this idea that was popular in the 60s. It fell out of favor, but I think it still has some interesting explicative power of orthotany, which is exactly like the ley line thing. The idea that UFOs travel along these lines that, as any line mapped on a globe would be, is actually a circle, right? As you alluded to with ley circles. And the idea fell out of favor. It was put forth by this French ufologist by the name of Ami Michel, and it fell out of favor because it was proven to be, well, sorry, Michel's specific examples were proven to be possibly the result of chance. But the idea, again, I think still has power, because you do hear about these sharp 90-degree turns in UFO sightings, and it certainly resonates with this older idea of spirits traveling in straight lines. But even if we have to completely abandon the idea of something like orthotany, it still has such a lasting legacy to this day. It's not only the reason that Jacques Vallée decided to embark on looking at older folklore, because Vallée was a big fan of orthotany, and in his diaries he said, well, that idea doesn't seem like it holds any water, so I'm going to focus on folklore. So that's an enduring legacy. But also, John Keel's window area idea was directly born out of his interest in orthotany and looking at these ancient sites. And the ancient sites he felt that had so much paranormal activity and UFO activity, often these window areas would be centered around a famous archaeological site. And, to this day, you still see this. Machu Picchu, the pyramids, a lot of the mounds in North America, these are all hotspots for paranormal activity.
Yeah, absolutely. What came to mind when you mentioned the subcarios, or however that word is pronounced, is the intaglios. There's the Blythe intaglios in California, and then there's the more famous intaglios known as the Nazca lines. And what I've read from Paul Devereaux is that one theory that exists is that shamans use these lines to get into the state of mind of whatever animal or figure that line fit pattern is representing. If they're following the bird line, then they're imagining themselves transforming into a bird. And you mentioned this in your book with the chapter or part of a chapter called Shamanimals, which I think is a beautiful what do you call it when you put two words together? I love that.
The portmanteau.
Yeah, that's a great portmanteau, Shamanimals. It's what when I was a kid, there's that show N.E.M.M.E.S.S, and that in my mind as a kid was so real to me. Like the ability for you to imagine that you're an animal and then become that animal. I don't know if I carried that over from a past life or something, but I believed that when I was a kid, and that TV show, just furthered my belief. And now I see here, Shamanimals. This is kind of it's well known now because of the Skinwalker Ranch stuff. I think a lot of people probably are familiar with the idea of a shapeshifter or this kind of lore around the shapeshifter, but it's not necessarily an evil thing. It's not necessarily only the Skinwalker. This idea of a shaman transforming into an animal, it's universal. It goes beyond that one area where the Skinwalker is talked about.
Yeah, and just like, look, I love these communities, right? Obviously I wouldn't be doing this, but like, so many people just get really dopey with the way that they want these things to be. Like, and what I mean by that is they want to see, a skinwalker, transform into a wolf man. I'm like, I don't think that's what is being described here. It's like the Dogman people who are like, I think a human had sex with a dog and they gave birth to a dog baby, and I'm like, that's not the way that works, and it's not the way this stuff seems to work either. It's very much tied into soulcraft, from what I can tell, and the idea that shamanic practitioners, and again, a very broad term, but we're just going to use that term, shamanic practitioners have such an awareness of the placement and the separability of their soul that they can allow it to sort of go off and do its own thing, and those things that it might do are just side effects that we would recognize today, or just out of body experiences that we would recognize today. But you find references time and again to these shamanic practitioners who are in their sort of out of body state, and to third party observers they look like ghost lights bouncing along. But that wandering soul idea is something that it seems that we're all completely capable of doing. The idea was that if you were in a trance or in any sort of altered state of consciousness, including sleep, that your soul would wander and go off and do whatever the heck it wants. Witches' Sabbaths, the Wild Hunt, but also that it might correspond to a zoomorphic counterpart, that it might correspond to an animal. This was where I'm sure that there are some older werewolf legends where it was a physical transformation, but if you look at a lot of them, it does appear that it's more of an astral inhabitation of an actual wolf, someone's spirit going into a wolf, or something along those lines. And I think that's probably, in my estimation, that's what the shapeshifter mythos that we see around the world is referring to more often than it is actually the full-bodied transformation. And you see this among the Nayas of, I believe it's Myanmar now, is where they live, and they're famous headhunters, but they believe that they had, certain headhunters would believe that they had a corresponding, panther, corresponding leopard, rather, in the jungle, that they sort of shared existence with, and wounds on the leopard would be reflected on them, and vice versa, which of course brings up wounds and alien abductions and stigmata and all sorts of other injuries that are inflicted upon people in this sort of astral state being reflected on their own physical bodies. But I think that's probably what a lot of this shape-shifting lore is probably getting at, is just the fact that people who foster an awareness of what their soul is can command it to do things that we can only do by happenstance.
Right. And there are a lot of what have been deemed by academia, anthropology specifically, as primitive, right? These self-mutilation type acts. One story that I actually heard firsthand from someone who had gone through this ritual is the eagle bone sun ceremony that goes on in certain tribes in the Southwest and the plains cultures in North America, where a young man, 19, 20, 25, in between that age, is left in a very, very strenuous position with an eagle bone piercing their skin on their chest, tied to rope or leather that's attached to a pole, and they're suspended from this pole by their wound for a number of hours or days until the eagle bone is released, right? It naturally will break at some point, and then either that or somebody comes and removes it, but either way you're sort of left there to make it back to civilization or to your village, And I mean, just the way you groaned there as I'm describing it, I too groaned when I was first told of this experience. And I think there is a certain effect that we've lost in our modern culture of the rite of passage. I think, it's been brutalized with this whole, draft and go to war. I mean, that's sort of an extreme version of it, what it could have been in the past. But I wonder if you can speak to that aspect of shamanism and its ability to push us to these, near-death experiences, and maybe that has something to, teach us.
Yeah, I've spoken about this here and there, but a lot of rites of passage do sort of resemble that shamanic initiation. It's the idea that, broadly speaking, with the rites of passage thing, it's this idea that your old self dies, right? And then now you're, from a boy to a man, or from a girl to a woman. And we just don't have that. And the things that we come up with, look, I'm not saying that we should pierce people with eagle bones, or that we should stick your hands in a glove full of bullet ants like some cultures do, right? I'm not saying we should do that. But the things that we do come up with to fill that void are, if we actually do them, because a lot of people just don't, they're not exactly healthy, and it's more extreme in the shamanic initiation stuff, because the goal of every shamanic initiation, whether it's brought on by substances or it's brought on by the spirit world inflicting a child with an or whether it's actually, someone who is selected by the spirit world and is buried alive or undergoes intense torture or pain, they all point to crossing that threshold or getting as close as you can to that threshold of death and then coming back. And when you come back from that, you have abilities, right? And I'll be damned, guess what happens? People go to fairyland, they come back, they have abilities.
Right.
And Jeffrey's a famous Cornish example. Near-death experiencers come back, they have abilities. They have clairvoyance, they have, RSPK, they have poltergeist phenomena around them. I'll be damned. People who have alien abductions have a significant ramp up in poltergeist activity in their homes. But these are all different things, right? They're completely different things. And it's like, well, it kind of looks like the same thing. You're going to some place, something is drawing you there, or you're going there and you're coming back, and you come back with abilities. And if you look at sort of the classical tradition, the Greco-Roman tradition, a lot of the seers, people who would just be born with these abilities, the claim was that they had been offered the drink of forgetfulness when they were being reincarnated so that they wouldn't remember their old lives. And the seers were the ones who, in the afterlife, declined to either pass over the plains of forgetfulness or declined to drink the brew of forgetfulness. And that's why they were able to retain all this knowledge and come back with these abilities. So it starts to look really hyper consistent to me. In the shamanic tradition specifically, you have a lot of different mechanisms, but oftentimes they do focus around intense physical stress. In some certain traditions in Africa, this is a ritualized dance where you literally dance to the point of exhaustion. In other cultures in Africa as well, and I'm thinking of specifically, you might be buried up to your neck in the hot, sweltering sun and forced to, basically the shamanic thing kind of just forces you to have a near-death experience in a lot of ways, just as far as we can, and then bring you it's just it's a fascinating correlation to me about just regarding that amount of consistency that you see. And I think that I think sometimes the psychedelic experience might be something like that as well. Because some people do come back and say that they have abilities. A really interesting study by David Luke and Mario Kittinas, I think it was just a couple of years ago, showed that heavy users of psychedelics report all these things that we've been talking about: telepathy, clairvoyance, phenomena, etc. But that the incidence actually increased when they were on the natch. When they were just like not. When they were not under the influence, that's when they experienced most of this stuff, which runs completely contrary to what we would expect. It's very similar to those brain imaging studies where people took psilocybin and their brain activity decreased. It's not what anybody expected, but that's what it seems to be. So there does seem to be some sort of indication that we put up a filter that sort of gets removed by these threshold experiences.
Right, and this is something you go over early on in the first volume, which is, our mind is not our brain. Our brain, is seems to be a receiver rather than the origin point. And I couldn't agree more. I think the Egyptians were onto this. This is why they, talked about our mind being in our heart rather than in our head. And maybe they identified more with that spirit or soul feeling. But there is a distinction, and you do get into that distinction between the spirit and the soul. But before we leave shamanism, I want to ask you a question. Do you think the New Age, right? Because you mentioned how the New Age has this sort of misguided disregard, this sort of even, sort of distasteful in some sense for this intentional syncretism, right? And I'm wondering if you think that that's, possibly propagandized to a certain extent. Because, Carlos Castaneda, he was out of the University of California. They have quite a reputation over there, and a lot of the New Age authors tend to be propped up by these same sort of groups. So I'm wondering, do you think that was like an intentional sort of thing to keep us from understanding these profound truths, maybe to further obscure and not bring clarity to it, because it makes people, believe this sort of pop shamanism is what we're talking about when we're talking about ancient cultures. And I mean, pop shamanism, that's just what they do at like music festivals. This has no, reality to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think all these topics, because they are so marginal, have been explored time and again. I mean, this is what I get upset at the modern disclosure crowd for not realizing. They're like, Daddy, please give me more candy. It's just like, this is not going to go the way that you think it has if you have any perspective on history. And I think that the New Age movement obviously has the earmarks of all that, while at the same time presenting truths. I mean, anytime you get something, anytime authority structures get involved in these communities, there's going to be truths and lies put together side by side so that you can't really tell the difference and whatnot. I can see easily how an authority apparatus would weaponize some of the New Age movement to, as almost a pacification project, as almost a way to encourage people to, I mean, because this is not a slag on the psychedelic community or the stoner community, but like there is a portion of people who just like sort of fall off the path when they get involved and they just burn out, So I can see that being another possible motivation for sort of weaponizing a lot of these messages. So yeah, I think it's entirely possible, perhaps even likely. At the same time, I have to be charitable to a lot of the New Age community. I mean, it's kind of the same thing. I feel about the New Age community the way that I feel about the evangelicals who talk about UFOs. You know what I mean? Because the evangelicals talk about UFOs and they're like, okay, well, they're just angels and demons. And I'm like, well, I don't, even though I'm a practicing Christian, I get what you're trying to say, but I just don't think that that's enough of a nuanced approach. I think that there's a lot of room between angels. I think that the ecology of souls has a lot of room between things that are purely negative and purely positive that are just sort of free agents. A shark doesn't care about you. Tornado doesn't care about you. It's not evil, but it will definitely, fuck you up. But at the same time, like I see that sort of, angels are demons attitude. And I'm like, I do resonate with that because I think it's, again, for me, your mileage may vary. I think it's closer to what lies behind the UFO phenomenon than little green scientists coming from another planet and nuts and bolts spacecraft, So like, I kind of feel the same way about the New Age movement. I feel like that they have a closer grasp on reality than a lot of reductionist materialists, but at the same time, it's just like too much of a good thing sometimes.
Right.
I did find something really fascinating that made me rethink the high low vibration thing. It's a little bit of a digression, but I'll try to get into it in and out of it really quickly. So a lot of people have tried to tie sleep paralysis to alien abduction, and there does seem to be some sort of connection there. But I would be hard pressed to not present a really compelling argument that a lot of these alien abductions seem to be basically somehow astral, out-of-body experiences. And there are some caveats. There are plenty of caveats. There are plenty of things that I go into in the book that refute that. But just generally speaking, they do seem to have that sort of out-of-body component to them. But tying alien abductions to sleep paralysis sort of ignores the fact that sleep paralysis is a very embodied sort of thing. Like you feel you're in your body, you feel you're being pressed down. Like it doesn't have that sort of like being lifted out of your body or lifted upwards through the ceiling of your house feeling that a lot of alien abductions have. But what I thought is that maybe, maybe that's the return trip. Like maybe when you go to sleep, we all go out of body all the time. We don't even realize it. And when we return, because these sleep paralysis experiences are often hypnagogic, it's when you're waking from sleep, then sometimes your car breaks down. You know what I mean? It breaks down in a real bad neighborhood because these things that appear in sleep paralysis are never positive. But here's the interesting twist. Researcher, I can't recall, when people were sleeping in high amplitude, electricity was applied to the brain. would induce autoscopy. It would induce that out-of-body experience. But if low amplitude voltage was applied to the brain, it would induce the sleep paralysis experience. And that's what made me say, okay, wait a minute. So you're saying high vibrations induce out of body experiences and low vibrations induce rather sleep paralysis, which has these negative identities. And how does the new age speak about these things? Oh, this entity is on a higher vibration, you need to raise your vibration. No, it's a low vibration entity, you've got low vibration, it's negative. I'm like, that actually lines up really well. Taking a look at the sort of things that you encounter in sleep paralysis and not. So it's things like that where I think that the new age movement is keyed into a little bit better. But I think that, in a perfect world, we'd have people who are small s skeptics combined with a lot of these other people who are into these topics and who are, advocating for caution of claims simply because they don't want their hearts broken, right? Like, that's me. Like, I'm not a skeptic, but I always try to take a skeptical approach when I'm out in the field or something because I don't want my heart broken. So yeah, I think that there's some truth there, but taking it and sorting it all has become so difficult because, just like with anything else, there are a lot of ninnies, a lot of crazy people in there.
Indeed, yes, that is something.
I mean, and we all live in glass houses, right? Like, right. somebody tuning in at random to this show is like, these people are crazy, and I realize that as well. I realize that.
Well, this is a perfect name for a show for crazy people to talk. But
that's true. That's true.
Yeah, I take it well. I think I take it in stride at this point. But when it comes to what I've seen in my local area, I mean, when I told you I dropped out of college, I was dropping out of college because at that point in time, I preferred hanging out on this park bench on the New Haven Green over going to class. And why? Because I was learning so much there. I was meeting people of all different types, from, the upper echelon of Yale students to the lowest rungs of, the impoverished class of New Haven, and everyone in between. And then as I'm learning more about the local area, I find out that whole spot that I was sitting at, the exact part of the park where I was sitting, is a grave. It was the ancient burying ground of the town of New Haven when they were first established there as a colony. And one of the interesting portions of our conversation that I'm going to circle back to is what we talked about. Well, it's all been interesting, but for me, when you said boats and how boats are a very rich, inanimate symbol, New Haven, the town, the colony, had a sighting in 1664. I think it was one of the first UFO sightings in the American colonies, if we can call it a UFO. But what they saw was a phantom ship, which appeared in the clouds over the harbor and reminded them that they probably lost their ship that had departed a few months earlier. It was sort of like a harbinger of doom. And of course, months later they found out that ship never made it to its destination. And it's really strange considering everything that's gone on in New Haven and Connecticut since. We kind of have a reputation for being a haunted state over here. And our first sort of major ghost encounter was a haunted ship. I wonder if that bears a sort of, icon for what's to come.
Oh, I mean, I absolutely think so. I mean, you said if you can call it a UFO, and I'm like, of course you can. It's unidentified, it's flying, and it's an object, It's, I mean, that's very passport to Magonia, right? Like the idea that you'd actually see ships in the sky that might like literally drop anchor to the earth. But again, speaks to the way that it's another, I feel like it's another nail in the extraterrestrial hypothesis coffin. These things are not consistent, in terms of the way that they appear. It's a very sort of Jacques Vallée idea, but, you did have like ships in the sky. And then, looking to a more modern era, you would have these steampunk airships, around the great airship wave in the early 1900s. And then in the 50s, we got Art Deco flying saucers. And in the 80s, we got black triangles that, sort of looked a lot like terrestrial technology, and now it's these, fucking Tic Tacs and like plasma balls. It always just sort of stays a couple of steps ahead of what we are. And I'm not saying that, I'm not saying that an extraterrestrial civilization wouldn't improve its technology over the past 150 years or something like that. I'm not saying that, but there's such stark departures, and they always seem just a little bit more accomplished than we are. You know what I mean? Just like, maybe we could just get there. I mean, like the fact that the Tic Tac has taken off in the era of the drones. I mean, it looks a lot like a really high tech drone. I'm not saying it is a high tech drone. Don't misinterpret what I'm saying. But the fact that it sort of bears a resemblance to, again, just being a little bit ahead of us, I think is really interesting.
I think that speaks to the co-creative aspect of what we're talking about here.
100%.
Yeah, and how like something that's been digested is not co-created in the next rendering, so to speak, right? As the energy is rendering, if it's already been processed by the human mind collective to a certain percentage, well, it's time for a new rendering, and it appears in a different way.
Totally agree, and as way of illustration regarding related phenomenon, there's a great bit of scholarship that's out there that everybody can look it up online. It's Simon Young's Fairy Census, and I believe it goes through 27. And Simon Young is a scholar who is fascinated in fairy stories and just fairy history and all these things. And one of the interesting things that you notice about reading the Fairy Census is that a lot of these encounters sound like Disney. People will see fairies that correspond to folklore fairies, right? They'll see fairies that look like human sized but are just sort of mystical, or they'll have fairies that are short but don't have wings, because the wings thing was an artistic flourish. Like, we can say that with a great degree of certainty. It wasn't until Shakespeare and some children's books and stuff that fairies got their wings. But people see fairies with wings today, which certainly speaks to that co-creative aspect. But the interesting thing, and I can't say this for certain, it's just a rumor right now, and I haven't spoken to Simon, even though I'm relatively close with him. I haven't spoken with him about this specifically, but he's compiled a new census from 2017 to 2022, and I have heard second, third hand from people who have spoken to him about this, that the fairies are starting to lose their wings. And I find that fascinating when you put it when you put it up against this resurgence in paganism and this resurgence in the magical renaissance that we're living through. The idea that people would become more familiar with what fairies actually were and start to see them that way, I think speaks to there being a co-creative component at work. I really do. It also reminds me of a story about my editor on Ecology of Souls, Barbara Fisher. She runs the 6 Degrees of John Keel podcast, and she's a lovely lady. I'm going to be working with her stuff in the future, but she's also a quite amazing experiencer, and lived in a home in Ohio, and she would see ghost lights out back and would always just assume that they were the fairies, the fae folk. And she at the time had a metaphysical bookshop, or like a magical supply shop in town, and she had given a sort of a little seminar workshop on fairies. And the first thing she said was, fairies don't look like small women with wings. They just don't look like small women with wings. The actual fairies are blah, 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 the stuff that I've just told you, right? And on 4th July, that following year, or that following into the following 4th of July, a bunch of people were out front. She didn't really care about fireworks, so she was back with a friend, and the ghost lights appeared. People might say, oh, it's 4th of July, how do you know there were ghost lights? Well, she saw and continues to see ghost lights on the property. It's not, that's a non-starter for the discussion. But she and a friend were out back, and they were singing, and as they were singing, they noticed that a couple of lights were approaching closer and closer. And sure enough, one got within just feet of her. And basically, long story short, the light, if I recall correctly, it popped and then it reformed. And inside the bubble was a little woman with wings. And she got a voice in her head that said, we can look however we damn well please. And it was, so that's a really interesting sort of co-creation anecdotal story that suggests that we might be looking at something like that with these phenomena broadly, because I do think a lot of these things are connected, and I think that you can extend some of that co-creative idea to some cryptid encounters as well.
Yeah. It's fascinating, too, when you realize that fairies are certainly not limited to Europe by any means. There's stories of little people all over North America. Here in Connecticut, there's the Mohegan tribe who claims that there's I always forget their name. It's not Pukwudgie. It's like something similar.
Muckwitch, maybe? Or,
Yeah.
No. I think Muckwitch might be a people.
It starts with an M.
Sigwesi?
It starts with an M.
N.E.M.M.E.S.S.I.S.
Yeah, I think
maybe?
you might be onto it because it starts with an M. But they live in this underground location in sort of eastern part of Connecticut, and H.P. Lovecraft famously spent some time in Connecticut at a different site, Makamutis State Park, where the Makamutis noises are heard, and this sort of lore around this area is that there's an underworld god that rumbles every now and then, and the Native Americans would do some sort of sacrifice to appease him, we're told, or at least that's what the colonists observed. Who knows if they were they tended to bias everything when they observed anything, hence the names Devil's Den, Devil's Field, Devil's Hop Yard, and all the other devil toponyms.
Yeah, that's I'm trying to remember which story that inspired, because he used it as the basis for one of the stories.
It was something noises. He took I don't know. I could look it up really quickly, but the Mutis noises are definitely strange. There seems to be, again, like many elements that comprise these zones, because the Mutis noises are on a state park.
Dunwich Horror.
What's
Dunwich
that?
Horror.
Okay, the Dunwich Horror. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
So that's on the Connecticut River there, which is a very large river in terms of New England rivers. And also the Gillette Castle is not too far from there. And the Gillette Castle was built by the man who played Sherlock Holmes famously, and it houses a rare collection of tarot cards that are from the 19th century. So there's sort of a magic atmosphere in that area, whether intentional or not. It's sort of, to your point, this energy requires these types of things to be built there. It's almost like our instincts propel us to fill that void appropriate to the energetic blueprint, Well,
I didn't realize until I visited Coral Castle that it's right there in Skunk Ape territory. You know what I mean? It's like, okay, well, that's interesting.
Right. Yeah, the Florida, don't get me started on Florida. I just spoke to a guy who runs a YouTube channel called Old World Florida, and there's a lot of interesting claims being made in that old world realm these days, but he has his sights on the right target, in my opinion, and he's kind of showing some correlations between what we are told is the mythological Fertile Crescent and the Gulf of Mexico, claiming that maybe the Gulf of Mexico would have been this Fertile Crescent, and he's found these stone anchors that show that there was clearly very large colonies of people using very large ships, much older than we're told. So, yeah, this history of America is very strange. Any comments on that?
I haven't seen the new Graham Hancock show. I don't know how his thinking has evolved on Atlantis and where it was. I know that for a while there was the Bimini Road, which would kind of be vaguely in the right part of the world. Well, I think that the Bimini Road is not as favorably looked upon by Atlantis theorists now. But maybe that's part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, and John Michel's of New View over Atlantis kind of, I think, inspired a lot of people to look at America as possibly, the site of Atlantis. And I don't know if I'm fully swayed by that, but it is interesting to see the connections between, structures here and the old world, and then see the corresponding lore associated. Like you see the little people in the fae folk in these same areas in America associated with cairns and standing stones and whatnot.
Well, that's something that really fascinated me. And, I'd never gotten the chance to write about ancient before, really. So I just always wanted to do that. But having been to Ireland, and like made a stop at every fairy fort I could correctly identify, and having been to as many mound sites here in the U.S., like I know there has got to be somewhere $200 reward for anybody who can find this, right? And I mean that, like, there's got to be an allusion in some old Irishman's diary about them like stumbling across some of the mounds and then being like, oh, they have the fairies here too, because like these things look so similar. I have a presentation where I show an Irish fairy fort in like County Clare or something. And I have a picture of that, and I have a picture beside it of the Etowah Mounds here in Georgia, pre-excavation, when they're still covered with trees. And I say, okay, who can tell me which is the fairy fort? And it's always split 50-50 because they just look so similar, and there's so many similarities in construction. There are even some mounds that tragically have been since demolished, but there are even some mounds that were once in Greenup, Kentucky, that have what you would call a hingiform construction, which is very similar to the Irish forts where you have a large moat on the outside. That has its own implications for, spirit conjuration as well. But I find it just fascinating that you have these New World mounds looking a lot like some of these Old World forts. And I'm willing to entertain the idea that there was some degree of cross-pollination, but kind of like we were talking about earlier with, cultural contamination among the Cherokee Little People myths, I find it really interesting, or I find it as compelling, that no, there wasn't any cultural transmission in the creation of these structures. The creation of these structures looks so similar because, damn it, this is just the best way to contact these things. You know what I mean? It's kind of like the bow and arrow. Like, no one really says that, like, the bow and arrow was imported from elsewhere into the New World. It's just like, well, this obviously just works. Like, if you're playing with this stuff long enough, you figure out a bow and arrow.
Right.
And I would argue, and I would suspect, I kind of think it would be cool that if cultures just play with the spirit world long enough, they figure out some of these shapes and some of these designs, just draw this stuff in better, which would be another way to explain why we have so many pyramids everywhere. It's just like, no, it's just why it looks that way. But again, pyramids, sort of being a variation on the mountain idea, just like the mounds and the tumuli are as well. Like it's a mountain that brings you closer to the axis mundi, the omphalos connecting the upper and lower worlds.
Right.
That's a lot of academic words.
No, I'm with you, and they have a very similar myth lore about this wall of the Manitou here in upstate New York and New England. The Hammonasset line that Glenn Kreisberg writes about in his book Spirit in Stone. It comprises of cairns, standing stones, all across the landscape in an exact straight line that crosses from the point of Long Island Sound through Connecticut, through the Catskill Mountains, and then up to the Great Lakes region. And this wall of the Manitou in the Catskills was one of those axis mundi points where Native American tribes would go in a sort of rite of passage. They'd climb to the top, and there was even a sort of challenge, like, there's 12 peaks. Whoever gets to the, past the 9th peak, that's a real man, or that's a, medicine, so there's this whole dichotomy or hierarchy of different spots you'd go to depending on your personal archetype or your trajectory.
Right.
And it's fascinating to see that line, them all lining up, and it lines up with the equinox. Go figure. All of these have astronomical alignments, and that just speaks to the gateway of the soul concept, this idea that your soul would use these lines to travel to the axis mundi and then follow that into the other world after you passed.
Yeah, and the thing about those astronomical alignments is, that's where the ancient alien impulse comes in. It's like they were trying to align to make sure that the UFOs could find a way to land. And it's like, but yeah, but these people thought of the overworld, as I like to call it, like they thought of that as like another other world, and
Right.
a stellar sea in a lot of ways. And this was the vector point for spirit communication. And the night sky below the ecliptic was the underworld. And you find in a lot of Native American cosmologies that, like, this is a really counterintuitive idea for us, but you had to ascend to the path of the Milky Way to actually reach the underworld, to reach the afterlife. And there was an OG at the center of the universe. Sort of, people, again, the science nerds are like, maybe they were describing a black hole. And I'm like, look, it just, you know, it's like, don't mix your science and your mysticism, because you wind up with bad science and bad mysticism. Like we had a perfectly fine vocabulary for a lot of this stuff for centuries. And like, why are we throwing that out to talk about dimensions and stuff? Like, that's why I continue to just say otherworld, and to just, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But yeah, to your point, like, I hear stories and examples like that, and I'm like, man, I wish I'd included that. Number one, the book's long enough as it is, but number two, when you're writing a book that involves so many universal ideas, you get to a certain critical mass and you're like, I just don't need to list all these, because, like, you will, if you learn about this, if you learn about the fact that mountains were the site of revelation for ancient cultures, and you just hold that idea in your head, you're going to see it in your daily life. You're going to see it on the History Channel. You're going to see it in movies. You're going to see it in books when people don't even think about that. Like, it's so ingrained into us, that idea of ascending to the top of a mountain for spiritual revelation, to contact the divine, to meet a monster or anything like that. It's just baked into everything it's baked into all of our media. It's baked into all of our ideas. Like, it's just, you can't escape it.
Right. Yeah, it's fascinating too, especially when we focus on the mounds. Here in New England, there aren't as many mounds, we're told. Maybe there were in the past, maybe there are that have just never been, fully recognized. I've seen one or two that I can tell from my own, understanding that are mounds. But you made a point in Ecology of Souls to make the comparison between Wilhelm Reich's orgone generator and the construction of mounds. And this is really fascinating, because one aspect of mounds that isn't really talked about is the middens. The middens are a type of mound that were built primarily in places where they had less soil to work with, and mostly seashells, right? And from your book you wrote that seashells were found even as far in as like Kentucky. They had seashells in their mounds. So seashells were very important, but they have these middens that archaeologists and anthropologists call trash piles, and we don't think they're trash piles, right? And
Yeah.
Limestone, as we talked about before, is basically that exact material, just pushed and squeezed and forced into stone over many, many years, and all these pressures in the earth. So it seems like there's a through line here, right? Limestone, the seashells, and then we have this orgone component where Wilhelm Reich found, a certain combination of materials built in a certain box. When you sat inside of it, you would have a, healing effect, an energy effect. And maybe that's what these mounds are doing in a sort of inverted way. You don't have to go inside of them. You just stand on top of them.
Yeah, and it was one of those things when working on this where it's like you start to see an idea and you're like, okay, well, if this line of speculation holds true, I should be able to find this elsewhere. And, you find that sort of layers of alternating organic and inorganic strata in the mounds. You find it in places like Silbury Hill in England, and I was like, okay, so that's two different places that we're associating with strange phenomena. Like, is there going to be a third? And I'll be damned. A lot of ring forts would have alternating stacks of stone and humus, which is highly organic dirt as well. So it's like, okay, well, it looks like there's something to it. This idea that you can sort of harness or generate or amplify orgone energy through this alternating strata is something that I suspect might have something to do with the incidence of supernatural quote unquote phenomena around these sites. Yeah, it's really is fascinating. And it's interesting. You mentioned the seashells in Kentucky, and how did they get there? Where did it come from? It really puts one in the same mindset as a lot of these megaliths in Ireland and the British Isles, where they find out that like, oh, the quarry was like 300 miles away. It's
Right.
like, how do they? Why did they need it from there? It's
Right.
very similar in a lot of respects, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing that comes to mind on the topic of mounds is I don't remember exactly who brought this up, but somebody I was talking to or someone I listened to on a show mentioned that when a body is buried in the earth without a casket, without, this sort of barrier between you and the soil, your body is sort of disintegrated over time, and there's actually a percentage of genetic material that can be found in the soil where people are buried. So to a certain extent, a mound, if it was a burial mound, has the DNA of our ancestors inside of it, right? So there's a certain, from the reductive materialist standpoint, they can at least recognize like, oh, okay, like there's light codes emanating from this soil somehow. But on the more metaphysical perspective, like it just speaks to the idea that we go to these places as a gateway or a liminal space between here and whatever's beyond.
Well, and that's something that I find really interesting too, is this idea that the word human comes from, I alluded to humus earlier, like it's all bound up in this idea of dirt, and obviously that's a quasi biblical perspective, ashes to ashes and dust to dust, but there is this idea of grounding and being just more connected to the earth and more connected to the soil and more connected to this original environment that we were all intended for. And it's unsurprising when you see stuff like, scientists say that spending 10 minutes a day in the grass in your bare feet is good for you, good for your attitude. I'm like, yeah, no shit. Like
Right.
it's where we are and come from.
Right. Well said, man. And this has been such a good dive into so many topics that I really do love, and as much as I wanted to have a full-blown Bigfoot conversation, I think the Ecology of Souls book it hits me at just the right time, and I look forward to including you on a project that I'm working on involving New Haven, if you'd oblige, for another interview in the future. But yeah, Josh, it looks like we're coming up on our time limit here. Where can folks go to get the book? Is there a website that you personally host that is the best place to buy it, or do you not mind that people go to Amazon? How should people pick up the book?
So this requires a little bit of explanation. I did self-publish this time, and I hate to admit it, but Amazon's self-publishing platform, in terms of quality and ease of use and just the ability to bind big books is really quite good. So if you want to go to Amazon, that's the only online retailer where it is available. However, if you write me directly at my website, there's a contact form there. I not only offer signed copies, but I offer them for less if you actually buy multiple copies. So you can save about $20 or $30, depending on exactly what you buy, if you buy the set. Of course, this applies to the lower 48. It gets a little bit difficult with international and Alaska and Hawaii and et cetera. But so yeah, either through Amazon or directly from myself. And my website is Joshua Cutchin, JOSHUACUTCHIN. If the most affordable option is to pick up the Kindle. The Kindle includes volumes 1 and 2 and all the endnotes. If you pick up the physical copies, it's volume 1, separately volume 2, and then the endnotes and appendices and bibliography are also separate. You can pick up a copy of those in physical form if you are a print media aficionado like I am. Or I've also made that same volume available on my website. So you don't have to pick up the Ecology of Souls Companion. If you get volumes 1 and 2, you can just go to my website as well.
Wonderful.
A little bit of a mouthful there. A little bit confusing.
No, not confusing at all. I appreciate the explanation. I do like to ask because I think there are plenty of people in the audience who prefer to go the more personal route and pay you directly and get your signature. Although, well, let's not flood Josh's inbox, folks, because he does have young kids and a family and a life to live. So go to Amazon, support this man, and go to his website and see what's coming next. I'm sure there's a place where he posts maybe relevant research and all sorts of things like that. I recently heard him on Chris Knowles' Secret Sun Mystery Hour, so you can hear him there. And just search Josh's name. He's all over the place. He's been on a bunch of podcasts. But thank you, brother. I appreciate your time. And until next time, ladies and gentlemen, enjoy the moment wherever you are.